rising young generation will be able to bring about the reforms, and particularly the political reforms that are necessary to really harness the energy and the potential of this youth explosion, this population boom.
Welcome to another video in the IATP Explainer series. This week, we are joined by Joshua Meservey. Joshua Meservey is a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, where he studies African geopolitics, counterterrorism, and refugee policy. Reports of terrorist-related activity seem to come out of Africa frequently. Has violence increased? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think unfortunately there has been an uptick in violence on the continent. In fact, in Africa's Sahel region, over the last 4, 5, 6 years, it's seen a greater increase in terrorist activity than anywhere else on the planet. So that's really concerning, obviously. You also have very active groups in Somalia. That's Al-Shabaab, of course, which has been active there for well over a decade. And you have newer groups like a group that's also sometimes known as Shabab in northern Mozambique. It's not the same as the Somalia Al-Shabaab, but it's very active, very violent, and potentially has ties or does have ties to ISIS, although we're not sure totally about the nature of those ties. So yeah, there has been a real increase in African terrorism. I think it's due to a combination of factors. One is weak governance. This is a problem that facilitates terrorism all around the world. And unfortunately, Africa has a significant concentration of poorly governed countries. And that facilitates, as I say, terrorist activity. And you've also had the spread of deeply fundamentalist Islam on the continent. So Salafist thought has been essentially exported really to the continent. There's been a few indigenous Salafi-style movements, but mostly the Salafism that we see today on the continent is a result of a lot of time and money spent, particularly by the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Kuwait and others, proselytizing a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. Now, I want to be clear, not all Salafis are violent. In fact, it's just a small subset of Salafis that are violent, but all African terrorist groups are Salafi in their inclinations and their theology. So I think that combination of factors has led to this growth or even explosion, really. It's been that dramatic of a growth in terrorist violence on the continent.
The Chinese Communist Party has been spending lots of money in Africa. What are they hoping to gain, and how should the West respond?
I think China's goals have shifted somewhat over the decades that they've been involved in Africa. So almost immediately upon the formation of modern China in 1949, they began to reach out to the continent. Initially, their goals were under Mao were to establish themselves as the leaders of the global revolutionary movement, the communist global revolutionary movement. And Mao saw Africa as a fertile area for that type of activity. China was also concerned about what they termed as hegemons, so that would be the Soviets and the Americans. And so a fair amount of what they did on the continent was trying to bedevil whatever the Soviets and the Americans were up to on the continent. But as I say, I think that's shifted over the years. So the Chinese became more pragmatic over the years. They began to focus more on economics, and they still focus heavily on the economic advantages that they can gain from their interactions with the continent. So previously, they used to source a fair amount of oil from Africa. That share of oil that they source has been falling over the last several years as they source more oil from the Middle East. So I think on the natural resources front, their focus has shifted more to certain critical minerals, particularly cobalt, or others like lithium, even more common ones, but like copper that are still essential to industry and especially to high tech industries. So the wave of the future is electric vehicles, for instance. Electric vehicles are very minerals intensive. They require a lot of minerals like cobalt, like lithium. And Chinese companies now dominate the supply chain for cobalt, for instance. And most of the world's cobalt is sourced from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. About 60% of the world's cobalt comes from there. So I think that has become more of the Chinese focus as far as natural resources are concerned. Now, I've argued previously in papers and such that the ultimate prize that China seeks in Africa is support for China's diplomatic goals. As China has become more assertive on the global stage, that sort of support for it at places like the United Nations has become much more important. And that means Africa has become more important to China. Africa has emerged as a major source of support for Chinese policies in places like Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, on the Taiwan question. African countries vote at a very high rate with China, or their votes coincide, I should say, at a very high rate with China at the UN General Assembly, on the Security Council, at the Human Rights Council, et cetera, et cetera. This is all very valuable to China. As I say, it becomes more aggressive in pushing its foreign policy goals and achieving its foreign policy goals, which it largely is trying to do through multinational forums like the United Nations. So I think that's a major part of what China is seeking now in Africa. Economics still play a part. It has major companies from politically important sectors like construction, for instance, that make a lot of money in Africa. There's now a quite large Chinese diaspora there. So part of Beijing's concern is to protect that diaspora. They have to demonstrate to the Chinese people that they are able to take care of its citizens, both at home, of course, but also overseas in places like Africa. So that's also a concern. And then I think there's a number of other things that China's after, but I would sort of focus on those as, the economics, the diplomatic support, the certain key minerals as the major reasons that China is in Africa.
The African Continental Free Trade Area recently went into effect. How do you think free trade and economic freedom as a whole can alleviate some of the continent's problems?
I think it's critical. This is one of the missing components of Africa's attempted development. Unfortunately, most African states score very poorly on measures of economic freedom, for instance. And my organization, the Heritage Foundation, has an economic freedom report, an annual one. And African states always do very poorly. There's a few outliers, but I'm speaking in general. And there is very low rates of, for instance, intra-African trade. The Continental Free Trade Agreement that you referenced is an attempt to address, in part, that lack of intra-African trade. A lot of trade barriers, a lot of non-tariff trade barriers, which are particularly thorny and difficult to eradicate. So I think this is a critical element of why, or one of the primary explanations for why African countries have failed to develop at the rate that we all hoped. Now, underpinning that problem is the problem of governance. To me, that is the core foundational deficit that African countries suffer from. African countries have the expertise and the knowledge to understand that system, free trade, for instance, generally benefits most citizens most of the time. But it's oftentimes a lack of political will to break down those trade barriers that I referenced earlier, or to free up their economies, to lessen the regulatory burdens, to make the regulatory structures and systems coherent. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think again, it's a lack of political will, and that stems from sometimes corruption in corrupt countries. Rulers are actually incentivized to maintain a heavy regulatory burden on businesses, because freer businesses make it harder to plunder the economy, frankly. So when you dissipate power from the center and you distribute it among the population, including businesses, small businesses, and corporations, and et cetera, it makes it harder for the political class to take advantage of that system. So it's much more complex than that. I'm obviously just pinpointing one reason here, but I do think that's one of the primary problems and why we don't see more economic freedom and more trade on the continent. Now, there is some, I think, ideological opposition at times to those concepts. There's some parties that, still subscribe to a more socialist perspective on the economy, and that's a vestige of their colonial or their anti-colonial struggle sometimes when the Soviets assisted them and the Chinese in some of those instances. Some of it is just a sort of anti-Western impulse, an colonial, what they would say is an anti-colonial impulse. And they associate things like capitalism and free markets and free trade with their colonial masters. So there's an antipathy there for that. So that's part of the equation as well. So of course it's complex, many reasons that contribute to this phenomenon, but fundamentally it's a destructive one. I think African countries would greatly benefit from freeing up their economies for really, leaning into free trade. I hope this continental free trade agreement is successful. It's a wonderful idea. I think it's the right idea. I'm nervous about its implementation because there have been smaller such programs. I'm thinking of regional economic communities all across the continent, like SADC or the EAC or COMESA, that never achieved the integration that they were supposed to achieve. And the countries that were signatories to those agreements never brought down, for instance, the non-tariff trade barriers that they had agreed to. So this is a much more ambitious undertaking. This continental free trade agreement is a much more ambitious undertaking than the regional economic communities, which were not successful. So it seems I'm nervous that they, it'll be even harder to implement the CFTA. But let's remain hopeful and try to support them as much as possible.
Why are you optimistic about Africa's future?
Africa has a lot of inherent advantages. It's still a very resource-rich continent, although those resources are being depleted. There's some countries that have relied a lot on petroleum or oil, for instance, and now their oil deposits are being depleted, as I said, and now they're left with harder to reach oil deposits and things like that. But there are still a lot of natural resources like cobalt, which we've already discussed, or copper or lithium, or any number of important minerals, gold, uranium, etc. So they have that natural wealth. They have a youth boom. They're in the midst of an extraordinary explosion in the youth population. By 2100, one of the estimates that I've seen is that 1 in every 4 people will be African on the planet, excuse me. Or it might even be 1 in 3, but so it's just a massive explosion in the population. And there's, of course, a demographic dividend that economists like to talk about, where you have a lot of working age people that can drive forward the economy and really help develop the countries that they are in. My optimism is tempered, I would say, by some of these governance problems that I've already referenced. I wonder how governments that already poorly manage their populations will be able to better manage larger populations. That seems to be an even greater challenge. So I have some concerns there, and I hope that maybe a rising young population, a rising young generation, will be able to bring about the reforms and particularly the political reforms that are necessary to really harness the energy and the potential of this youth explosion, this population boom. Otherwise, things will be very difficult on the continent. They will continue to be difficult, just with more people. So I think these are hotly debated topics in the Africa policy space, where some people are more optimistic and some like I are less optimistic. Uh, but Africa does have very significant advantages. It's just a question of proper governance and ensuring that governments are uh, performing their duties honestly and efficiently and capably. If those things happen, then I think Africa will see an extraordinary boom, an economic boom, a prosperity boom. And I certainly hope that that will be the future for Africa. And that's, I root for that. I hope for that. And do whatever small thing I can to try to help achieve that end.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to follow the IATP on Twitter at @the_IATP. Also, hit the like and subscribe button below and check out our website at www.theiatp.org.